Hello and welcome to the sort of the online lesson that I had planned that I said I'd post on YouTube and basically go through with you. Obviously, some of you who are in that session sort of got the first 20 minutes or so of this. I'm going to quickly go over what I sort of talked about very quickly for those who weren't there, and then move on to other stuff. Unsurprisingly, very apologetic that for whatever reason the technology didn't work. I'm going to have a little bit of a fiddle around. I do think it's useful to do some sort of session maybe once a week where we just kind of catch up. As I said at the start, it's not designed necessarily to teach you new stuff, but to develop some of the stuff. And you'll see perhaps later on what I mean by that, where I can just give you a little bit more information about something that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily have. So, just for those who weren't there, all I did was start by talking about the idea of a keen and clear understanding of audience is important. So what you need to do with any text, or especially a comparison, is to really look at, who is the audience for the first one, who is the audience for the second one, and also any similarities between the audiences, of course, as well. So as we move on, so the first thing I sort of identified was the similarities. I put question marks next to all of them because, it's debatable, it's tentative. We don't know for definite what the audience is. Obviously, some of the things we can assume without having to kind of worry or challenge too much. Like, for example, a football fan will be the target audience for these two things. Because it is The Guardian, though, you can assume some level of intelligence. Again, be careful when you talk about intelligence because you can run the risk of being like, oh, the audience will be clever. What you need to be is be more tentative and say, it would imply a certain level of education. Probably middle class, probably left wing, because it is The Guardian. Someone wrote in their answer that it was from The Observer, and it is from the Observer section of The Guardian. And it's a bit confusing because there is the Observer newspaper, and they're part of the same kind of corporation or group. So just bear that in mind. I think it's easier to talk about it as The Guardian because The Guardian has clearer defined kind of politics and ideas, I would argue. So the audience for As It Happens is, I've put on the move, perhaps time restricted. So basically, maybe flicking it on because you're on a bus going somewhere or commuting to work, or in some ways don't have access to Sky or the television at that point. I also mused about the idea perhaps that it is more likely to be fans of the actual team. That was in comparison to perhaps the news report that I felt was a little bit more broad. Perhaps like if I am a fan of a team that is neither Man United or Crystal Palace, I might be inclined to leave alone the As It Happens because maybe I don't care so much, but I might still read up about the article itself. However, it is the FA Cup final. The FA Cup is quite a big deal. So, again, tentative audience we're sort of discussing here. Audience of the news report, I said not time restricted. The report was, not huge, but it involved a bit of reading. Maybe fans of football in general, people who want to know a bit more. I said not necessarily the fans of the team themselves. And then the interest in the world around the football. There was a lot more about the politics, a lot more about the people around it, other managers, other teams, other things being referenced that weren't referenced in the As It Happens. Now, notice how these can be the same people. That was kind of one of the main takeaways I wanted you to get from this. This time, the audience isn't completely different. The audience is the same person, but in different circumstances. There are some subtle differences, and there will be different people reading both things. But there can be someone who checks out the As It Happens, but then half hour later, when the game is finished, reads the news report, and they're the same person. Their needs have just changed. So do just bear that in mind when it comes to sometimes these that actually, the person may be the same audience member, but they're going to have some different need or way of accessing it or reason to access it at a certain time or whatever it may be. You're unlikely to get two texts like this to compare at any point. This is more of an exercise of practicing your skill at like picking up patterns and things like that more than anything else anyway. So production, again, talked about this a bit before the thing crashed. As It Happens is time sensitive, therefore it lends itself to shorter sentences and high frequency lexis. Basically, they only have so much time to write the next thing that's going to happen before something else happens. They are limited by the amount of time they have before the next big event happens, and it just lends itself more to shorter sentences, high frequency lexis, and the people reading it don't need to have all the information. They need literally what is happening at that moment in the game. The news report, especially The Guardian, if it was in a different newspaper, it might be slightly different. Some of this will aim to incorporate more challenging grammatical structures, lexis to engage, entertain, and inform a predominantly intelligent and middle-class audience. I said one of the things you need to bear in mind, and be careful again how you phrase it. I thought also, just to draw your attention to it, the writer might want to show off by the time they get to the news report. They are writing for a well-respected, well-considered newspaper, And actually, they want to show, look, here are the big words you can use. Here are the interesting metaphors I can use. Here are the interesting allusions I can make to other things. So they are sometimes trying to show off. And the person who writes a newspaper report these days, they're more prominent on the actual report itself. You can, and I do, follow certain people and they're reporting on things like sports and entertainment. So actually, you can get known for having a certain writing style, get known for having a certain viewpoint, get known for having a good way with words, and part of that needs to be engaged with. It just says here the best answers will try and engage with production. It's harder though, but if it's engaged with effectively, it will tend to get you more marks. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. A lot of people did really well for audience stuff when they were looking at it, but production is kind of key to those really high grades. So I'm going to kind of briefly go over these, and again, you can always pause the video if you need to have a look at these in more detail. I tried to just basically clip areas that best highlighted what we were looking at. So this was for Lexis. I took the last thing that was posted for the football game, if I remember rightly, or one of the last things, and then the first paragraph from the news report just said what can be suggested about the use of Lexis. Because most of you went through this already, I'll skip forward to the next slide. It just says here, mixture of monosyllabic and two-syllable words, high frequency, low register. We said it's more akin to speech almost. It's the way we talk. We tend to default to simpler words when we are talking to people. And he is, I say he, I mean, it could be a she, of course. I do believe it was a man in this instance. They are effectively talking to us. They are leading us through this game. And there's no real pretense to being sort of anything other than just a report of what is going on from minute to minute. And we'll look a little bit more at that as this goes on. The first paragraph, more polysyllabic lexis, higher register, lower frequency. So kind of often it is when you're asked to compare, there isn't kind of an opposition there in terms of the fact that often one will have high frequency words and one will have lower frequency words. It's just a case of working out which one's which. It's still accessible though. It's not designed to be too challenging because, as I said, an educated audience, but middle class educated doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be using particularly challenging jargon, specialist lexis that is beyond the capabilities of the audience. It still needs to be readable. It still needs to be engaging the audience. They're still trying to sell a newspaper at the end of the day. I mean, I know it's a website, so therefore you don't pay for it as such, but they do get people signing. You can sign up to the Guardian now, and also if you access the website, you get money for clicks and for adverts and things like that. So they need to guarantee people coming onto the website. So this was around the area where things started to slow down a little bit in terms of it. I think it crashed basically. So I'll spend a little bit more time here. Again, I've identified here two sentences from the As It Happens and then a fairly long paragraph from the news report. What I suggest you do is have a bit of a look at it, spend a few minutes, and then, as always, about 5 seconds on the video, I'll then move on and talk about what you could have said. Okay, so this I found this As It Happens bit quite interesting because there are a couple of things going on here. It says here minor sentences and sentence fragments. So you have the idea here of the ellipsis, and this one is offside. There was some talk in the chat about this carrying on from the one that happened before, and that's how ellipses are normally used. But actually, in this instance, it's being used for tension because it is trying to drag us into the sort of the excitement of the match itself. It is the 89th minute. It only ended up 2-1, so therefore it was a close game, and they're using it in a way that makes it more about the tension that's generated than anything else. It is only a sentence fragment though. It's not really a full sentence as such. So you could argue it's non-standard forms, and you can definitely argue non-standard forms when they say 2v1. They mean 2 versus 1 there, but it's shortened perhaps the way you might verbalize it if you were talking to someone and we're talking about football. I've said here it's more akin to speech, and it is basically the way we talk. We don't often talk in full sentences necessarily. We sometimes use fragments. We might use non-standard forms. Yet the second sentence is a compound, complex sentence. It's not a simple sentence. It's got a bit more complexity to it. Sort of, I guess fitting with the idea of who it's aimed at, it is still aimed at a middle class educated audience. So there are going to be elements there that kind of link to that audience overall. The the second bit is fairly straightforward. You have more complex sentences, you have some embedded clauses to give information, and longer sentences in general. I should put here though, longer doesn't always mean complex. You can have a short complex sentence, and you can have a long simple sentence. So you can engage with not only whether it's simple, compound, or complex, but pretty much the length. And I mean, I've boxed that first sentence. That first sentence does go on for quite a while, and actually the paragraph itself is only made up of two sentences. So there is a belief perhaps that the person who's reading it will be able to understand longer sentences and sentences with more information, or it goes back to the writer trying to, and again I say show off, I wouldn't use that terminology in a response, but trying to flex their kind of writing skills by showing that they can kind of incorporate multiple clauses into a sentence and control the pace of the sentence and the content and things like that. It's just stuff that you need to bear in mind, of course. The slightly harder one, or the slightly harder two, I guess, is discourse and pragmatics. Now, discourse throws some people sometimes, and it is as simple as kind of what are you seeing, what is there. And I've put similarities and differences. As always, you might want to spend a few minutes before I go on, and I'll give you 5 seconds on the video, and then I'll talk you through basically what you could have identified. But it is quite straightforward in terms of, what do you see in front of you. As always, 5 seconds, and then I'll talk you through. So I have said here similarities and differences, because actually you don't have to always be engaging with the differences. So both of these are multimodal. They both use picture and video and text. So therefore it's worth bearing in mind that. They both have social media links that allow for easy sharing. Now, as it happens, has that for every single event. The one for the newspaper report only really has it at the top left, but it allows that to happen. So they both have that, but just implement it slightly differently. Similarly, they both have timestamps. So the as it happens has it after every event. The newspaper, the report on the website has it top left, so just one sort of news timestamp. It's less likely to change on a news report that you have on a website, but you do have it sometimes when breaking news happens. Things do change, and they do update those timestamps to reflect any changes that have happened at the time. So it's the fluid nature of stuff reporting on websites means timestamps become incredibly important, because it shows that what is being said is up to date. Paragraphs, headline, byline of the report, they're like a newspaper. Like the thing on the left is designed to represent as close as you can get to a newspaper, yet with all the new fancy bells and whistles of sharing links and adverts and images and videos, and stuff like that. So it's designed to be representative of what we would see in a newspaper, and with that, I would argue perhaps believable. It may sound really sort of silly to say it wouldn't be believable, but the fact that it fits what we would expect a newspaper to look like, and people generally, up until arguably the most last few years, do trust what they read in newspapers. Often the move in terms of technology to new kind of communication, you have the new communication taking some form of the old way of doing things. Think about emails. Emails basically were initially electronic letters. Sort of chats on Messenger were very similar to how we used to talk either on the phone or in real life. And they do somewhat mimic it with new things on top. So that's what I would say is going on here. It's more like a newspaper. This was mentioned in the chat before the thing crashed. As it happens, does look a bit like social media. And it does link to how Facebook and Twitter were looking at this time, and they have changed their algorithm slightly in terms of what you see. But generally, the most important information, which in the game of football is the last thing that happened, arguably, goes to the top, and it makes it easier to access and easier to understand and easier to find if you are time restricted. The most important part, you get the result. At the top, you get imagine that was updating as it's going on. You get the result as it is at the moment. You get the last thing that's happened, and you have the option of clicking through to other things if that's what you want. Pragmatics was difficult. I had a few of you email me about pragmatics. Now, pragmatics is most difficult because it's about the information you need to know to understand a text in more detail. And you could argue that pragmatics exists everywhere. Like, you need to understand the words that are being said and the topic and the focus and all that stuff. So I often sort of draw it to, are there references to things? Are there metaphors? Are there idioms? Are there sayings that you would not understand unless you knew a bit about the sport or the topic or the focus of the thing or the entertainment that's being talked about? The examples I came up with here You see it here with the as it happens. The names assume knowledge about who the players are, and there is some light jargon like volley and corner. Now, most people know what a volley is, most people know what a corner is, but we can't assume. And they are showing that the person typing understands the game of football. That a player volleys a ball and a player can be offside. It becomes more challenging, perhaps, in the report itself, and that's probably because they've got time to write it. They can come up to with more allusions to things and more references to stuff from other walks of life in a way that you don't really do if you're just writing it as you go along. I've just said here the references that are pragmatic here also include things not related directly to the game. So it references Jose Mourinho, and it does give you a sense that he is Van Gaal's old friend and colleague, but actually it doesn't say who he is. And you can assume, based on the fact that he's going to be installed, that he's a manager. But there is an element here of pragmatics, the fact that you'd need to know a little bit about who Jose Mourinho is before you can really say anything about him. And similarly, they reference a goal that has happened 26 years earlier. Again, you can assume that they're talking about a winning goal of some sort. But without that extra knowledge, the reference loses a bit of its understanding for some people. These types of pragmatic references are primarily for me, and it's in both instances as well. One of them is for speed, you could argue, the idea of jargon and the names of the players, but they also show that the person who is writing it understands things, and it also it's that building a sense of almost like a community. The idea being that if you share a reference with someone and they understand it, it's inclusive, isn't it, in some ways? So if they say, oh, that goal that happened then, and you're like, oh, I know about that goal that happened then, you get a sense that you are part of what's going on. And just, it's about understanding and, building a sense that there's knowledge and information being shared with the audience at this point. I just put these last one here. It didn't really fit under any of the categories necessarily, but you notice here that there's just generally the first, as it happens, is more informal. They use taboo language. We've already talked about minor sentences and sentence fragments, but just it builds up a convention of the style being more informal. It seems more real, perhaps, more immediate, more like your experience in the game. Like, it doesn't matter that the player swore, so it doesn't end up in the report, but reporting that they swore in the as it happens makes it, kind of makes you feel like, oh, okay, if I was there, this is what I'd be experiencing, this is what I'd see, this is what would happen. They are trying to make it seem lively and exciting and engaging, and kind of making up for not being there or making up for not being able to see it. I've always also said, or chatting about football with a friend, this whole thing of it being somewhat akin to speech, to me, it was almost like someone's watching it and regaling you with what they see, which kind of is what it is. But they're not trying to, so there's no pretenses to make it any more challenging or difficult than that. Anyway, moving sort of on, hopefully that's covered some of the ideas. Mainly that's the kind of the language patterns. So from there, what you need to then do is think, well, okay, so what is it about the context? And I have kind of covered it as we've gone along, but it's up to you, obviously, to make sure you kind of work out how that links perhaps to that audience we first decided on. Language in the media, just putting this up here. This is on the PowerPoint that I've already put up there. This is on a video I've already put up, but it's just worth having a look and just familiarising yourself with this, just so you know exactly kind of what you're doing. But I was mainly going to just throw up, this is the thing where I was saying about the development of ideas, is just how AO2 works here, because it says concepts and theories, and that can be a little bit confusing, and some people aren't sure what sort of fits within that, especially because this is gender, power, technology, language change, and anything else. So on the next slide, I've just put concepts and theories, and this is like, you might want to add this to your notes and just make a note of it. And this is not the only thing you can talk about, but here are some of the things that you might look for in a language and media text. So power, ideas around synthetic personalization, instrumental and influential power. I don't teach power myself, but I do believe there's an idea about power behind the discourse, and various things around that. And representation. Representation is key to doing this. So basically, how is power represented, or how are people in power represented? As we move to gender, you have socialization, you have stereotyping, you have gendered expectations, you have gender roles and how they're presented, and once again, as I said, representation. Representation basically could be everywhere, because it is key. So again, how is gender represented? How are ideas about gender represented? Language change is not often one that is mentioned by people, but it is worth bearing in mind because it's language in the media, processes of language change might be worth looking at. So how new words are implemented, so loans, blends, compounds. If they are talking about something to do with the media, or you see a something that is referencing technology in some capacity, so even a button that says, like this, that is a change in the functional shift of an actual word. So therefore, again, some engagement with that might be useful. And finally, technology, you're looking at multimodality. So the idea that you kind of have to engage in multimodality because there's always going to be multiple modes. Synchronous and asynchronous communication. This is more if you are given an online forum sort of chat, or even like an article which also includes the comments. The comments are asynchronous. You're not talking at the same time, so it allows people basically to write things and then reply to things. So it might be worth just being aware of that. Engagement with social media. We talked before about the idea of the buttons that allow you to do that. That's kind of more present than before. And, once again, can't say it enough, representation. So again, how technology is represented, how technology is used to represent things, and things along those lines. This slide is a useful thing to have reference to, just because it gives you a sense of, these are the places you might look when you first are given a language and a media text. And finally, AO3 remains as ever: genre, audience, purpose, production, and reception. There are a few other things you might look at, and I have talked about those in some of the early language and technology lessons, like cost. But they all kind of fall within the same remit. So you always look for your language patterns, you start talking about your concepts and your theories, and then you link it to the context of the text. I hope that was useful. Obviously, any questions, as always, just email me, let me know. Be well, stay safe. I will try and reorganise a session at some point next week, but I'll let you know nearer the time. I'll be trying to sort out the technology side down my end. I've got a few other opportunities to test it out, so hopefully, fingers crossed, next time it'll be okay. As always, just let me know if you're not sure about anything, and we'll leave it there. Okay, cheers, bye.